There's a moment, just one moment when you realize your life has fundamentally changed. Not gradually, not over time, but in a single instant. For most people, that moment comes on a day they'll never forget. A phone call, a letter, a look in someone's eyes that tells you everything has shifted. For me, that moment came at a table in one of the nicest restaurants in the city, somewhere we'd never been before, somewhere my wife had wanted to celebrate. The kind of place where they fold your napkin for you, and the wine list has more pages than some books. The kind of place where they know how to make you feel special, or conversely, where they know exactly how to humiliate you in front of everyone who matters. I was sitting with my wife Diana, my 2 adult daughters Sarah and Jennifer, and my son-in-law David. We were celebrating an anniversary, my wife's promotion at her job, something normal, something that should have been happy. Instead, I was about to have my entire world turned inside out. I didn't know it yet. I didn't see it coming. I thought we were a family. I thought we loved each other. I thought if you showed up for people, worked hard, did the right things, played by the rules, life would treat you reasonably well. I thought family meant something. That's what I believed walking into that restaurant that evening. That's what I believed for the first 30 minutes of dinner, when the conversation was normal and everyone seemed relaxed. By the time we reached the appetizers, though, I was starting to realize how wrong I'd been about everything. How naive I'd been. How much I'd been missing, not seeing what was right in front of me. I can still see the exact moment it happened. The waiter had just set down our main courses. Prime rib for me, medium rare, exactly the way I'd ordered it. Seared scallops for my wife, with risotto. Various other dishes around the table, expensive-looking plates with careful arrangements of food. We'd ordered wine, the kind my son-in-law had picked out. An expensive red wine that he was sure would impress everyone. He'd made a show of it, discussing the vintage with the sommelier, displaying knowledge that I wouldn't have. The dinner conversation was the usual surface-level family talk. My younger daughter Jennifer was talking about her new job, how she was adjusting to the responsibilities. My older daughter Sarah, the one married to my son-in-law David, was being quiet, the way she'd been for the last 6 months or so, withdrawn. I'd noticed that shift. I'd mentioned it to my wife. She said Sarah was just busy, just stressed, that I was reading too much into it. Maybe she was right, but something felt off. My son-in-law David was about 3 glasses of wine in, becoming louder, becoming the centre of attention the way he always did. He'd been making jokes all evening, the kind of jokes that made me uncomfortable but that everyone else seemed to laugh at. Jokes about my age, my job, the way I dressed, the restaurants I liked, jokes that had a bite to them even when he smiled. He was telling the table about a golf outing he'd been on last month, how he and his business associates had left one of the older guys in the group to fend for himself while they went to a fancy dinner at a restaurant he knew. The old guy had to find his own place to eat. Everyone at our table laughed except me and my wife. Diana looked uncomfortable. David noticed. He looked at me and suddenly his face changed. His smile became something different, something sharper, something mean. He said, "You know what we told that old guy when he asked if he could join us? This table is for family. Go find a spot outside." He paused, letting that land, watching everyone's reactions. Then he turned to me directly, his eyes locked on mine. He said it again, but this time he was looking right at me, speaking directly at me. "This table is for family. Go find a spot outside." My younger daughter Jennifer giggled nervously, that laugh that comes when you don't know how to react to something cruel. Sarah looked down at her plate immediately as if she could hide there. My wife's hand found mine under the table and she gripped it tight. David's eyes were locked on mine, and I could see he was waiting for something. He was waiting to see how I'd react. He was waiting to see if I'd get angry or cry or defend myself, and either way he was planning to mock me for it. My older daughter Sarah suddenly excused herself and went to the bathroom. Everyone watched her go. David was watching me. I picked up my coffee cup. My hand was steady, which surprised me. Maybe the accounting mind, the part that deals with numbers and facts every day, took over. I took a sip of black coffee. Then, very deliberately, I pushed the entire plate in front of me away from my body. The plate that probably cost $40, maybe $50. The plate with the expensive prime rib that was perfectly cooked, that I'd been hungry for before this moment. I pushed it across the white tablecloth until it was no longer in front of me, and I said nothing. The table went absolutely quiet. David's smile faltered. My wife squeezed my hand so hard it hurt. Jennifer looked like she wanted to disappear into the floor, like she could melt into the chair. My younger daughter started talking very quickly about anything else. The weather, her job, filling the silence with noise because she couldn't stand the weight of what had just happened. But nobody was really listening to her. They were all watching me. They were watching the old man push his plate away. That's what I was by then. The old man, the guy who doesn't belong at the real table. And then the waiter appeared. His timing was perfectly, devastatingly terrible. He placed a check folder in front of me. Not the table. Me. Specifically me. It was like he'd been trained to deliver this at exactly this moment. The bill was $2,237. For a moment I stared at it. Everyone stared at me staring at it. David was smiling again. Not the smile he'd had before. This smile was different. This was victory. This was the culmination of something he'd been building toward all evening. Without looking up from the check, I could feel my wife's body go rigid next to me. I could feel the temperature at the table drop another 10 degrees, David said softly, almost conversationally, like we were old friends sharing a private joke. Yeah, I'm not covering the whole table today, Michael. This is family. That table's for everyone. You wanted your own table, remember? Outside, he laughed. It was the first truly genuine laugh I'd heard from him in months. There was real pleasure in it, real satisfaction. Sarah didn't come back from the bathroom. Later, my wife told me she called an Uber from there. Called an Uber and went home rather than come back to that table. She couldn't watch anymore. I needed to understand how I got here. How my own son-in-law could orchestrate something like that. How he could humiliate me in front of my daughters, my wife, the restaurant staff, complete strangers. How he could make it look like a joke, like a harmless comment while watching to see if I'd break. How my family would sit there in silence and let it happen. So I reconstructed it. Not that night, but in the days after, sometimes in the middle of the night when I couldn't sleep, which was most nights after the dinner. I played back months of conversations, moments I'd thought were small, insignificant, interactions I'd brushed off as nothing, as just David being David, but they weren't nothing. They were a building block. They were a foundation. They were the groundwork for what would happen at that table. And once I started seeing the pattern, I couldn't stop seeing it. It was everywhere. Every conversation, every family gathering, every moment I'd tried to ignore. I realized that what happened at that table didn't start at the dinner. It didn't even start with the golf story or the expensive wine or the comment about my plate. It went back further, much further. To the very beginning, when David first entered our family and took his careful measure of us, identified our weaknesses, identified what he would eventually destroy. My name is Michael. I'm 48 years old. I work in accounting, which is to say I have a stable, decent job that will never make me rich, but it has paid my bills reliably for 23 years. No frills, no glamour, just steady work that I'm good at. I've been married to Diana for 22 years. We have 2 daughters, Sarah, who is 26, and Jennifer, who is 23. For most of my life, I did things right. I showed up. I paid attention. I tried to be a good father and a good husband. I was present for school plays and soccer games and graduation ceremonies. I helped with homework, sat at kitchen tables while they studied. I took vacation time to be with my family. I was there. I wasn't perfect, but I was consistent. I was reliable. I showed up. When Sarah told us she was dating someone named David Harmon, I thought it was fine. Good-looking, had some money from family business, confident in that way that comes with money, charming when he wanted to be. They dated for 3 years before he proposed. I remember the dinner when he asked for my blessing. He was respectful. He seemed nervous. He talked about how much Sarah meant to him. When they got engaged, I told myself I needed to be supportive. My wife Diana loved him immediately. She said he had energy, that he made her laugh. He paid attention to her in ways that I sometimes didn't. He brought her flowers without being asked. From the outside, he seemed like a perfect son-in-law. We planned a wedding, paid for most of it, because that's what you do when your daughter's getting married. Sarah was happy, or at least she seemed to be. David gave a rehearsal dinner toast where he talked about how grateful he was for a real family, people who actually cared about him. His own parents were too focused on business, he said, always working, never there. We were different, he said. We were better. We were the family he'd always wanted. I remembered thinking he seemed lonely underneath all that charm. I thought maybe Diana and I and our girls could fill something in him that was missing. I thought we could help him become the man he wanted to be. The problem started about 8 months into their marriage. Nothing dramatic. Nothing you could point to and say, that's when it began. That's the moment everything changed. It was more like erosion, like water wearing down stone, gradual, almost imperceptible at first. David started criticizing small things. The way I tied my tie, which he said was outdated. Nobody wore ties like that anymore. The jokes I told at family dinners, which he said were outdated and not funny. The car I drove, which he called a dad car in that tone of his that wasn't quite joking. The company I worked for, which he said was boring and conservative and going nowhere. The clothes I bought, the restaurants I recommended, the movies I enjoyed. Nothing was ever right. Nothing I did or said or chose met his standards. And what was strange was that everyone else seemed to think it was funny. They laughed. Sarah would grab his arm and smile and say, "That's just how David is. He's got opinions about everything." Like it was endearing, like his constant criticism was just part of his personality, something we all had to accept. But it didn't feel fine to me. It felt like I was being inventoried, categorized, and found lacking. My wife noticed it too. She started defending me more, which I appreciated but also hated because it put her in the middle. She'd say, "Actually, Michael has great taste in restaurants," or, "That's not a fair thing to say about his company." But the more she defended me, the more David would push. It was like he was testing boundaries, seeing how far he could go, how much disrespect my wife would tolerate before she shut him down. And once I started paying attention, I saw he was doing it to Jennifer too, though he said different things to her. He'd comment on her appearance, on who she was dating, on her career choices. He'd suggest she was wasting her potential or her looks or her youth on something that wasn't good enough. Jennifer would often apologize, defend herself, explain her choices. Sarah would try to smooth things over. My wife would get frustrated and leave the room, and I would sit there trying to figure out what game we were playing, what the rules were, how I could possibly win, or if winning was even the goal. The real escalation happened about 4 months before that restaurant dinner. David and Sarah came to our house for Sunday dinner. They did this regularly by then, though I'd started to dread these Sundays more and more. My wife always put on a good spread. She'd make Sarah's favourite dishes, things she knew David liked, spent hours in the kitchen preparing. Everything had to be perfect for David. That particular Sunday, I was grilling steaks in the backyard. David came out to help, though what he really meant was standing too close and making unsolicited suggestions about everything I was doing. The steaks were too expensive, he said. I was wasting money on that kind of quality. A decent steak from anywhere could taste the same. He said it like he'd done extensive research on this topic. My grilling technique was fine, he said, but conventional. Pedestrian. He could teach me a better way. He launched into a detailed description of restaurants he'd been to, the techniques they used, wine pairings that would work better, improvements I could make to our deck and yard, our deck that we'd built together as a family 10 years ago, our yard where my daughters had played when they were young. Nothing I was doing was right. Nothing was good enough. As he listed all these deficiencies in an almost cheerful tone, something shifted deep inside me. I realized in that moment that nothing I could ever do would be good enough for him. It wasn't about my steak grilling skills or my deck or my taste in wine. It was about me. It was about who I was, what I represented. I was the man from the old generation, the boring man, the man with a boring job and boring opinions and a boring life. And David was the new generation, the successful businessman with polish and confidence and money that wasn't yet completely eaten by gambling debts and bad investments, though I didn't know that then. And he was suggesting, without saying it directly, that I was obsolete, that I was a relic that everyone tolerated because they had to, but no one would choose if they actually had options. After he said something particularly cutting about my wardrobe, suggesting my button-up shirts were what grandfathers wore, I looked at him and I said, "Why do you come here if you hate everything about us so much?" I said it quietly, but I meant it. He smiled. He actually smiled at me like I'd just made a great joke. He said, "Oh, Michael, come on. I'm just busting your chops. Can't you take a joke? Lighten up, man." But his eyes weren't joking. His eyes were cold and satisfied, like he'd been waiting for me to react so he could explain why I was the unreasonable one. He said, "Besides, somebody has to help you all keep up. You're good people. You're decent. You just don't know how to do anything modern. Times are changing and you're all stuck in the past. I'm doing you a favour." I wanted to argue. I wanted to tell him exactly what I thought about him. His contempt, his passive-aggressive criticism dressed up as mentorship. I wanted to tell him that I'd been working since before he was born, that I had a steady job and a good life, and that nothing in my house needed fixing by him. But Sarah came outside at that exact moment, and she looked nervous. Not her normal face, not relaxed, nervous. She said, "Dad, dinner's almost ready." "David was just helping you with the steaks, right?" Her voice had a pleading quality to it. I looked at my daughter, and I could see shame in her face, maybe fear, maybe something else I couldn't quite name. And I realized in that moment that if I said anything, if I called out David's behavior, I wouldn't be the man standing up for himself. I'd be the problem. I'd be the difficult one, the one who couldn't let things go, the one who was too sensitive, the one who was making things awkward. So I said, "Yeah, thanks for the tips, David. Really helpful," and I took the steaks off the grill. That dinner at my house was one of the most miserable meals I've eaten in my own home. Everyone was quiet except for David, who talked mostly to my wife, who seemed flustered and anxious throughout the meal. Sarah pushed food around her plate, barely eating anything. Jennifer looked at me with something like pity in her eyes, like she understood that something was wrong but felt powerless to stop it. My wife and I didn't talk much after they left. We got ready for bed in silence, moving around each other like careful strangers who'd forgotten how to speak. Before we turned off the lights, Diana said, "He's not a bad person, Michael. He's just insecure. He doesn't know how to fit in." I wondered if that was true. I wondered if I was being unreasonable, if I was the problem. Maybe he was just trying to prove himself to us. Maybe I was the one being difficult. But I also knew what I'd seen in his eyes. It wasn't insecurity. It was contempt. Pure, calculated contempt. I'd seen that look before in my career in accounting, in business dealings where someone was trying to establish dominance. But not from someone who was supposed to be family, not from my daughter's husband. From that point on, everything accelerated. The criticisms became more frequent and more public. At family gatherings, at birthday parties, at casual dinners, David would make jokes about how I was aging out of relevance. He'd say things like, "No offense, Michael, but guys like you are basically dinosaurs. The world's moved on." He'd talk about his accomplishments, his investments, his upcoming business deals, always making sure everyone knew that he was the future and I was the past. He'd make observations about my body, suggesting I was getting soft in the middle, that I should think about going to a gym. He'd make comments about my health, suggesting I looked tired or that I should think about my mortality at my age, as if my age itself was somehow embarrassing or wrong. He said these things in a jovial tone with a smile so that when I didn't laugh, I was the one who seemed unreasonable. When I tried to talk to Sarah about it, she'd get defensive immediately. She'd say, "He doesn't mean anything by it, Dad. That's just how he talks. That's his personality. He's sarcastic." I'd ask, "How is that humour? How's any of that funny?" And she'd say, "Now you're being unfair. You're making it worse." My wife tried too. She'd have careful conversations with Sarah where she'd gently suggest that maybe David was being a little harsh with me, that maybe he could dial it back, be a little kinder to her father. And Sarah would tell David about it. Of course she would, because that's what wives do. And suddenly David would call me up and offer an apology that was technically an apology but wasn't really one at all. He'd say, "Sarah told me I hurt your feelings. I'm sorry if you're so sensitive that my jokes bothered you, man." An apology that was really an insult wrapped in false concern. An apology that was designed to make me feel like the problem, like my hurt feelings were the real issue here, not his behaviour. I started avoiding him. I made excuses not to come to family dinners. I suggested my wife go without me, which made her upset. She'd say, "This is ridiculous, Michael. You're being childish. You're the adult." And I'd think, yes, I am the adult, and that's exactly why I can't be around him anymore. I was isolating myself, and I knew it. Every interaction with David felt like a test I was failing. Every family gathering felt like an ambush, like a trial where I was expected to smile and pretend and absorb the criticism and laugh along with everyone else. I was expected to roll my eyes at myself, to make jokes about my own obsolescence, to validate his worldview that everything I represented was outdated and wrong. And my family seemed to expect exactly that from me. They seemed to expect that I would just accept it, that I would laugh it off, that I would be the good sport, that I would not make things awkward by actually calling out his behaviour, that I would just endure and absorb and say nothing and keep showing up. But I was reaching a breaking point. I could feel it like a physical thing. The tension was building inside me like pressure in a closed container with nowhere to go, and somewhere in my gut I knew that something was going to give. I didn't know when or how, but I knew it was coming. I just didn't know it would come in the form of a $2,000 check placed directly in front of me, at a table full of people who would watch me receive it and say nothing. I didn't know my daughter would refuse to come back from the bathroom rather than witness what happened next. I sat there with that check in front of me, the number staring back at me like an accusation. $2,237. I kept staring at it, trying to process the numbers. 2,000 and change. My entire weekly grocery budget, my entire cable and internet bill for 3 months, the cost of my daughter's entire first year of college tuition before scholarships kicked in, the cost of the new roof we'd been saving for, the cost of the Caribbean trip Diana and I had been talking about taking for our 25-year anniversary next year. All of that in one number, and David was telling me this was my bill to pay, just me, for being here, for existing at a table with family. That's when everything I'd been trying to ignore, everything I'd been pushing down and explaining away, and telling myself was just misunderstanding or oversensitivity, suddenly became impossible to deny. I wasn't just being criticized by my son-in-law. I wasn't just dealing with a man who had poor social skills or a harsh sense of humor. I was being systematically extracted from. That's the only word for it. Extracted. Like a resource being mined, and once the value was gone, I'd be discarded. Like I was a bank account with a specific balance, and he'd figured out exactly how much he could withdraw before the balance hit zero. After that dinner, after Sarah left and Jennifer stared at her plate and Diana gripped my hand so hard she left marks, I drove home in complete silence. Nobody spoke. Not a word the entire drive. We got home and everyone went to separate rooms. Diana went upstairs. Jennifer went to her room. I sat in the living room in the dark for 3 hours before I finally moved. And then I started paying attention in a way I hadn't before. I started looking back at conversations, transactions, interactions. I started asking questions that I'd been too afraid or too embarrassed to ask before. The next day I called my daughter Sarah. She didn't want to talk to me. She kept saying she was busy. She'd call me back. This wasn't a good time. She made excuses. She made reasons why she couldn't have this conversation. But I was past the point of accepting excuses. I pressed her. I told her that I needed to understand what was happening and that avoidance wasn't going to work anymore. When I finally got her on the phone, really on the phone with nowhere to hide, she broke down crying. She told me that David had taken out a significant portion of their savings. Not a little bit. Not something that could be explained away or rationalized. Significant. $120,000. Over $100,000. She didn't know where it went exactly. He told her it was an investment opportunity, something that would pay off huge returns. She'd trusted him because he was her husband, and husbands don't lie about money, do they? She'd given him access to accounts she'd inherited from her grandmother. Money that had been meant for her future. She'd signed papers she didn't fully understand because he'd told her they were just formalities, just business documents, nothing to worry about. And now the money was gone. Completely gone. I asked her what she'd done about it. She said she'd asked David where the money was and he'd gotten angry. He'd told her she was being greedy, that she didn't trust him, that she was ruining their marriage by being suspicious. He'd said that real wives trusted their husbands with financial decisions, and that if she couldn't do that, then maybe they didn't have a future together. She'd backed down immediately. She'd apologized. She'd let it go, because the alternative was losing her marriage, and I realized in that moment that David had chosen his wife very carefully too. He'd chosen a woman who would defer to him, who would trust him even when her instincts screamed otherwise, who would sacrifice her own financial security for the sake of keeping peace in her marriage. When I asked David about the money directly, he laughed. He actually laughed at me like it was the most ridiculous question he'd ever heard. We were at the house for Sunday dinner a few days after I learned about the account. I pulled him aside into the kitchen and asked him carefully, trying to keep my tone neutral and non-accusatory, where Sarah's money had gone. Why had $120,000 been withdrawn from accounts he didn't own and wasn't authorized to touch? He laughed, and then his expression hardened. His whole demeanor changed. He said the money was in a venture that was about to pay off big, that Sarah was being dramatic and impatient like all women are, that I was interfering in their marriage by asking about finances that weren't my business. He said I was being a controlling father-in-law and that maybe I should focus on my own life instead of trying to ruin his. He said he loved Sarah and he would never do anything to hurt her, and if I couldn't trust that, then that was my problem, not his. He turned it around so fast that by the end of the conversation I felt like I was the one who'd done something wrong. Like I was the unreasonable old man nosing into his daughter's personal business. Like I was the jealous father who couldn't let his daughter grow up and make her own decisions without his interference. I walked away from that conversation feeling ashamed of myself for even asking the question, but I'd been in accounting for 23 years. I'd seen every variation of financial manipulation, every excuse, every manipulation tactic used to justify the unjustifiable. I knew financial predation when I saw it. I knew the difference between investment and extraction. I knew the smell of it. And what I was smelling coming from David Harmon wasn't the smell of legitimate business. It was the smell of desperation. It was the smell of a man taking money that wasn't his and hoping no one would notice. I started looking deeper. I started pulling records. I started making calls. I requested financial records. I looked at credit card statements. I traced money. Jennifer, my younger daughter, came to me with something she'd been holding back. She pulled me aside one afternoon and she was shaking. Her hands were trembling. She looked terrified and guilty and relieved all at the same time. She said David had asked her for money too. He'd asked her to co-sign a loan for him. Not a gift, a loan. But really he was asking her to put her financial future on the line for him. He'd told her it was for a business expansion, something that would take his company to the next level. He'd said it would be a quick and easy way for her to help the family business grow. He'd told her that her parents were too conservative to understand modern business practices, too old-fashioned, too stuck in the past. But she was different, he'd said. She was smarter. She was more capable. She had vision. She could see the potential in his vision where her parents couldn't. She could be part of something big. He'd made her feel special. He'd made her feel like she was smarter than me, than her mother, than everyone else in her life. And she was thinking about doing it. She'd actually gotten the papers. She'd almost signed the papers already. She had a pen in her hand, almost ready to sign when something stopped her. Some small voice in her head that said, "This doesn't feel right." When I explained to her what co-signing a loan actually meant, what her liability was, what could happen if the loan defaulted, she started crying. She said David had made it sound simple. He'd made it sound like she'd be stupid or unsupportive not to do it. He'd told her that her father would probably understand this kind of thing better, being in finance, but that her generation needed to think bigger than we did. He'd said I was the problem, that I was the reason nothing in our family ever progressed, that I was holding everyone back with my fear and my conservative thinking. I told her to never ever sign those papers. I told her I'd help her with anything she needed, but co-signing that loan could destroy her credit, could follow her for years, could tank her ability to buy a house or get a car or get anything she needed in her future. And that David knowing this and asking anyway was a red flag bigger than any flag I'd ever seen waving. We sat in the kitchen, and I showed her real examples of what co-signing meant. I showed her court cases. I showed her stories of people whose lives had been destroyed by co-signing a loan for someone else. She understood. She finally understood what he was trying to do. She said, "He's trying to use me to borrow money." I said, "Yes, that's exactly what he's doing. And if that loan goes bad, he walks away and you're stuck with a debt and a destroyed credit rating." She handed me the papers. She said she wanted me to keep them. She didn't want them in the house where David might pressure her again. My wife Diana and I had some of the hardest conversations we'd ever had during this period. She kept defending David, but I could see something shifting in her. I could see her starting to process things, starting to question things she'd been too willing to accept before. I started showing her the financial evidence, Sarah's statements, conversations Jennifer had recorded after I suggested she document things for her own protection, emails from David about investment opportunities that didn't exist, or that existed but had zero track record or reputation, loan documents with forged signatures that didn't quite match David's writing. Diana's face got paler the more I showed her. Her hand started shaking. She said, "He seemed so confident. He seemed like he had it all figured out. I believed in him." I said, "That's the point. That's exactly how people like this operate. They seem confident. They seem like they know something you don't. They make you feel stupid for questioning them. They make you feel like you're paranoid or jealous or trying to hold them back if you express any doubt." She asked me, "How did we not see this? How did I not see this?" And I said, "Because he was good at it, Diana. Because he picked us very deliberately. because he specifically chose a family where the women are trusting and kind-hearted, and the man was someone he could systematically undermine and isolate. That wasn't an accident. He saw what we had, and he saw an opportunity, and he exploited it. That's the truth of what happened. That's when she started to understand. That's when she started to see the pattern the way I'd been seeing it. Every criticism directed at me had a purpose. It wasn't random cruelty. It wasn't just his sense of humour. Every undermining comment had been strategic. Every joke about my age and relevance and my outdated ways had been designed to make me seem foolish, to make my concerns seem paranoid or old-fashioned or the ravings of someone out of touch. It was a campaign, not an accident. Not just his personality or his way of bonding. A campaign. A calculated, deliberate campaign to destroy my credibility and isolate me from my family so that when he did his financial manoeuvring, no one would listen to my warnings, so that when I tried to tell them something was wrong, they'd think I was just the bitter old man trying to control their lives and ruin their happiness. The week before the restaurant dinner, David had called me at work. My secretary told me I had a call from David Harmon, and something in my stomach clenched immediately. I didn't want to talk to him. But I also knew that avoiding him would be worse, that he'd find a way to make it my fault somehow, turn it into another example of how I didn't support him or appreciate him or respect him. I took the call. He was charming on the phone. He said he wanted to meet for coffee, just the two of us. He wanted to talk about something important. He said he'd been thinking about the family and about how he hadn't been making enough effort to connect with me. He said he wanted to change that. He wanted things to be better between us. My instinct was to decline. Every fibre of my being was screaming at me to avoid this. But I also knew I couldn't avoid him anymore. If I was going to protect my family, I needed to understand what he wanted. I needed to know what he was planning, so I agreed. We met at a coffee shop near my office on a Wednesday afternoon. He was there before me, already sitting at a table, already having ordered coffee. He had a pastry in front of him. He looked relaxed, at ease, like a man without a care in the world. He was unusually cheerful, greeting me with a smile that actually reached his eyes, which was rare for him. He wanted to talk about the family dinner that Diana had mentioned, the one at the nice restaurant. He said he wanted to make sure it would be special. He said it should be memorable. He wanted to make sure everyone knew how much the family meant to him, that he valued being part of something real and authentic. He said he'd been feeling a little disconnected lately, that he wanted to do something that would bring everyone together and remind us that we were a unit, that we were bound together by more than just obligation. He said it all with that charming smile he could turn on and off like a light switch. I remember thinking, there it is. There's the setup. There's the moment when he's laying the groundwork for whatever is about to happen. Because what I'd learned by this point was that every grand gesture, every special occasion, every moment he was orchestrating carefully was actually a stage being set. It was a performance. It was theatre. It was an opportunity to demonstrate his power and my powerlessness, and I was starting to see his calculation clearly. He wanted to do something memorable. He wanted something that would hurt me in front of witnesses. He wanted my humiliation to be public, to be watched and witnessed, so that later, when I tried to bring up my concerns about his financial manipulation, or his behaviour toward me, or his control over my daughter, I'd be the one who seemed like the problem. I'd be the one who couldn't let go. I'd be the one who was overreacting, who was making mountains out of molehills, who was reading too much into a joke. By that point in the week leading up to the dinner, I'd become someone I didn't recognise. I was suspicious of everything. I was passing every conversation for hidden meaning. I was analysing every joke for underlying cruelty. I was waiting for the next attack, bracing for the next moment when the ground would shift beneath my feet. Because that's what it was. It was an attack. Not all at once. Not clearly enough that I could point to one moment and say, there, that's when the assault happened, that's when the crime occurred, but systematically, relentlessly, designed to make me question my worth and my place in my own family, and I was terrified. I was terrified of what he might do, of what he might convince my daughters to do or believe, of what he might manipulate my wife into accepting as truth about me. The night before the restaurant dinner I barely slept. I lay in bed next to Diana, both of us pretending to sleep, but neither of us actually sleeping. I kept thinking about not going. I kept composing excuses in my mind. I could tell Diana I wasn't feeling well. I could say I had to work late. I could make up a reason that would be acceptable, that would allow me to avoid whatever was about to unfold. But I also knew that if I didn't go, he'd frame it as me being difficult. He'd tell everyone I was being oversensitive, that I couldn't handle a little family gathering, that I was being paranoid and controlling, and unable to let my family have a normal life without my interference. He'd make my absence the story, not the dinner itself, so I went. I showed up for my daughter's anniversary celebration. I showed up for what I thought would be a normal family dinner. I showed up and I walked directly into a trap that had been set so carefully, so methodically, that I didn't see it until I was already inside it, already at the table, already sitting where I'd been placed. Walking into that restaurant felt like walking onto a stage where everyone knew the script except me. I could sense it immediately. The space was too quiet. The energy was off. I remember seeing David talking to the hostess, pointing at different tables, checking his phone. He was coordinating something, planning something. He was making sure everything was exactly as he wanted it. My wife Diana was nervous too. I could see it written all over her face. I could see it. In the way she kept checking her phone compulsively, the way she touched my arm more than usual, her hand squeezing my forearm like she was trying to ground herself. She was nervous about how the evening would go. She had a premonition that something was about to happen. She just didn't know what. She couldn't articulate it, but she could feel it. The way animals can sense a storm coming before the sky even changes. Sitting down at the table, I felt physically cold despite the warm restaurant, despite the heaters positioned around the dining room. The ambient noise felt far away, muffled, like I was underwater. My senses were heightened to an almost painful degree. I was hyper-aware of every shift in mood, every glance exchanged between people across the table, every subtle change in the room's energy, every shift in tone or expression. David ordered wine with authority, making recommendations to everyone, performing expertise and knowledge he didn't actually possess. When the sommelier brought the bottle and showed it to him, he nodded like he was a connoisseur, like he knew everything there was to know about wine and vineyards and terroir. But I knew the truth. I knew he was drowning in debt. I knew he was desperate. I knew he was a predator, and I was sitting across the table from him. And somehow, knowing that made the show even worse. He was performing competence and success and sophistication, while actually being a house of cards held together with lies and manipulation, and the desperate hope that no one would see through him. Looking around the table, I saw my family. My wife Diana, who'd been with me for 22 years, who'd stood by me through everything. My daughters Sarah and Jennifer, who I'd raised, who I'd helped through breakups and job searches and all the uncertainties and fears of growing up. My younger daughter Jennifer was there, nervous, looking between David and me like she was waiting for something to break, and they were all watching this man perform. They were all, in some way, believing the show because he was so good at it. Even as the waiter approached with the check, moving toward our table with a purposefulness that seemed deliberate, I still didn't fully believe what was about to happen. I still thought maybe this would be a normal evening. Maybe I was reading too much into things. Maybe David was just being David and I needed to relax and stop being paranoid and just try to have a normal family dinner without looking for hidden meanings in every gesture. And then the waiter placed that folder down, directly in front of me. Not at the center of the table where it could be discussed and processed as a group, not to be shared among the family. It was placed specifically in front of me. I looked at it. I didn't want to open it, but I knew everyone was watching me, waiting to see how I'd react, waiting to see if I'd break or if I'd accept this with grace and humor. The first thing I noticed when I opened the folder was my name on the check, Michael, like the bill was personally addressed to me, like it was made specifically for me. I looked at the numbers and my vision seemed to tunnel. $2,237. The numbers seemed to vibrate on the paper. They seemed too large to be real. David was smiling. I could see it out of the corner of my eye. He was waiting to see my reaction. He was savoring this moment. He was watching to see if I'd cry, if I'd get angry, if I'd stand up and make a scene, if I'd humiliate myself even further by arguing about it or demanding an explanation. The moment stretched out forever, suspended in time. I could feel my heartbeat in my throat pounding so hard I thought everyone at the table could hear it. I could feel the attention of everyone at that table, the weight of their collective gaze. And then David said it. His voice was casual, conversational, like he was just making an observation. This table is for family. Not addressing me directly. Just saying it to the table, letting the words hang there. But everyone knew what he meant. Everyone knew who he was talking about. This table is for family. Go find a spot outside." That's what he was saying. That was the message. You don't belong here. My oldest daughter Sarah got up immediately after he said it. She left the table, she went to the bathroom, but everyone knew what that meant. She couldn't watch anymore. She literally couldn't sit there and watch what was happening to me. She was choosing to remove herself from the situation rather than witness it anymore. And in that moment, sitting there with the check in front of me and my daughter, gone, and my wife gripping my hand so hard her nails cut into my palm, I understood something fundamental about myself. I understood that I had two choices. I could accept the shame, internalize his narrative, believe that I was the problem. I could tell myself that I'd overreacted, that he was just making a joke, that I needed to learn how to take criticism and not be so sensitive. I could accept the story he was telling about me and internalize it as truth. Or I could stop being ashamed and start being angry. I could stop accepting and start fighting back. I didn't know how yet. How? I didn't have a plan. I didn't know what steps to take or how to protect my family or how to stop him. But in that moment, with a $2,000 check sitting on a white tablecloth in front of me, with my daughter gone, and my wife devastated and my other daughter looking at me like she was waiting to see if I would break, I made a decision. I made a decision that David Harmon had made a serious mistake in thinking I was someone he could break. He'd miscalculated. He'd pushed too far. He'd exposed his hand. And everything that happened after that moment, every step I would take, every decision I would make, would be about making sure that he understood that you cannot humiliate a man at his own family table and expect him to do nothing. Not anymore. The waiter was still standing there, and the check was still sitting in front of me, and David was still smiling that smile. I remember the physical sensation of my hand reaching for the bill folder, lifting it, my eyes tracking the numbers again like maybe they'd changed, maybe I'd misread them the first time. $2,237. No, I'd read them correctly. That was the amount. That was what he'd decided I owed just for sitting at a table with my family. My throat was dry. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my temples. And for just a moment I felt the weight of shame trying to settle on me again. That familiar feeling of being wrong, of being the problem, of having misunderstood the situation somehow. But then something shifted. Something inside me that had been resisting finally just broke. Not in a bad way. It broke the way a fever breaks. It broke like when you've been holding your breath and finally exhale. I thought about everything I'd uncovered. All of it. The forged documents, the stolen money, the deliberate campaign of undermining and isolation, the way he'd moved his hands from one of my daughters to the other, extracting value, creating division, leaving damage in his wake. And I realized something fundamental in that moment. This wasn't a joke. This wasn't miscommunication. This wasn't a personality conflict or a generational difference or me being overly sensitive. This was a con man playing a mark, and I was his mark, and he'd just made the mistake of thinking I wouldn't fight back. He'd pushed too far. He'd exposed his hand. He'd revealed the mechanism of his entire operation in one moment of overconfidence. I looked at him then, really looked at him, and I saw something I hadn't quite allowed myself to see before. I saw a predator who'd miscalculated the size and temperament of his prey. I picked up my coffee cup, took a long, deliberate sip, and without breaking eye contact with him, I pushed the folder back across the table. I didn't push it gently. I pushed it with enough force that it slid across the white tablecloth and stopped right in front of him. The impact made the silverware rattle. Someone at a nearby table looked over. The ambient noise of the restaurant seemed to pause, to hold its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. I could see Diana's hands trembling. I could see Jennifer's eyes going wide. Sarah was returning from the bathroom at that exact moment, taking in the scene, understanding immediately that something had shifted, that the energy had fundamentally changed. The entire table was watching now. Everyone knew something important was happening. David picked up the check, his expression darkening. His jaw clenched. A muscle twitched in his temple. "That's your bill," he said, his voice dropping from charming to something harder, something that revealed what was underneath the performance. "That's what it costs to eat here." His eyes were cold. I'd never seen his eyes like that before. All the warmth, all the performance just gone. What remained was something flat and predatory. I smiled at him then. A real smile, not the neutral mask I'd been wearing. I felt calm. I felt clear. I said, "No, it isn't." And I stood up. I buttoned my jacket slowly. I looked at Diana. I said, "We're leaving. Now. Not angry, not loud, just matter of fact. Diana didn't argue. She stood immediately, gathering her purse, her hands still shaking. Sarah got up. Jennifer got up. The three of us stood there with our family unity suddenly visible and physical in a way it hadn't been in months. David tried to say something else, but I just turned and walked toward the door. I didn't wait. I didn't engage. I just walked, and my family followed. We left David sitting there with a $2,000 bill and the sudden realization that his leverage, his control, his ability to humiliate me in front of witnesses had just evaporated. We walked out into the cool night air and I felt something release inside me. It was time to stop defending and start investigating. What happened next wasn't dramatic or explosive. It wasn't like the movies where you confront someone and everything gets resolved in one conversation. This was methodical. This was careful. This was exactly what someone who'd spent 23 years in accounting would do when faced with financial predation. I spent the first week after that dinner gathering information. I didn't tell David what I was doing. I didn't tip my hand. I just quietly started assembling documents. I called Sarah and asked her to send me copies of her bank statements going back 3 years. I asked Jennifer to forward me the email she'd received from David about the loan. I asked Diana to gather every credit card statement we had. I told them I was building a case, and I told them I needed them to trust me and give me access to everything. They did. Because by that point they were ready. They were done with excuses and explanations. Then I hired a professional, a forensic accountant named Catherine Wu, who specialized in exactly the kind of financial manipulation David had been perpetrating. I met with her in her office, a professional space in a downtown building, and I laid out everything. I brought documents. I brought credit card statements. I brought the communications I had from David. I told her about the loans that didn't exist, the investments that evaporated, the accounts that were accessed without permission. I told her about the pattern of pressure and manipulation. Catherine listened carefully, taking notes, asking specific questions about dates and amounts. She had a methodical way of approaching the information, breaking it down into categories, identifying patterns. At the end of the conversation, she told me she'd need access to bank records, credit card statements, loan documents, and any communications I had documenting conversations about money. She said she'd need at least 3 weeks to complete a thorough investigation. I told her time wasn't an issue. I wanted everything documented meticulously, because I suspected this would eventually involve law enforcement. I also consulted with a lawyer, someone named Marcus Finley, who specialized in financial crimes and elder fraud. I found him through a referral from someone at work who'd dealt with a similar situation in their family. Marcus was a careful man, the kind of attorney who didn't make promises he wasn't certain he could keep. I laid out the same information for him, but this time with legal implications. I told him about the forged signatures, the unauthorized withdrawals, the credit cards opened in Jennifer's name without her permission, the pressure on Sarah to hand over her inheritance, the systematic undermining of my credibility so that no one would listen to my concerns. Marcus listened carefully, asking questions, making notes. Then he explained to me exactly what crimes had been committed. The forged signature on the loan documents was forgery. The unauthorized withdrawal of Sarah's inheritance was fraud and possibly embezzlement, depending on how we categorized his relationship to the accounts. The credit card opened in Jennifer's name without authorization was identity theft and fraud. The pressure tactics, the isolation, the campaign of undermining my credibility, those were all part of a pattern that had a legal name: financial abuse. And in our jurisdiction, depending on the specifics of the documentation, it could be prosecuted criminally. Marcus also explained that prosecution would be challenging without a clear criminal investigation and police involvement. But with the right evidence, with proper documentation, there was absolutely a case. I spent those 3 weeks waiting for Catherine's report in a state of heightened attention. I went to work, I came home, I spent time with Diana and the girls. But my mind was elsewhere. I was thinking about timelines and patterns. I was thinking about how long this had been going on undetected. I was thinking about how many conversations David had overheard me having, where I expressed my concerns, only to have those concerns systematically dismantled in front of my family. I was thinking about how calculated every step had been, how deliberate, how designed. This wasn't impulse. This wasn't desperation leading someone to bad decisions. This was a deliberate plan executed with precision. The investigator's report came back on a Thursday morning. Catherine emailed it to me with a cover letter explaining her methodology. 43 pages, single-spaced, meticulously documented, every transaction traced, every withdrawal explained, every discrepancy itemized and cross-referenced. The report laid out a clear pattern of behavior stretching back 2.5 years. 2.5 years. That's how long he'd been systematically extracting money from my daughter's accounts, taking advantage of their trust, their willingness to believe the best about him, their willingness to accept his explanations and justifications. $120,000 from Sarah's inherited accounts. $45,000 in unauthorized charges on a credit card Jennifer didn't even know he'd applied for in her name. Loan applications with forged signatures that matched his writing less and less precisely as he'd gotten more desperate, less careful. Investment schemes that didn't exist, or if they did exist, had zero track record or reputation. Casino cash advance receipts. Credit card debt accumulated under false pretenses. Collection notices. Foreclosure threats. The whole pyramid of financial desperation laid bare in meticulously organized tables and charts. The total exceeded $300,000. $300,000! I sat at my kitchen table reading that number and I felt something shift inside me. It wasn't rage exactly, though there was rage underneath it. It was something colder than rage. It was clarity. It was the understanding that this man had stolen from my family, and now I had the documentation to prove it beyond any possibility of denial. Every excuse he had ever given evaporated in the face of this evidence. Every explanation he'd offered revealed itself as a lie. The pattern was undeniable. The scale was undeniable, and now I knew exactly what I needed to do. I brought the investigator's report to the police. I didn't call ahead. I just showed up at the precinct with Catherine's 43-page documentation, copies of the forged documents, the credit card statements showing unauthorized charges, the loan applications, all of it. I asked to speak with someone who handled financial crimes. They connected me with Detective John Morrison, a man in his late 50s who'd been with the department for over 20 years. He listened while I walked him through everything. He asked careful questions. He took extensive notes. When I finished, he didn't make any promises, but he was clear about what he was looking at. This was textbook financial abuse combined with fraud and forgery. He said they could open a criminal investigation, but it would depend on whether my daughters wanted to press charges. The crimes had been committed against them, after all. The money was taken from their accounts without their permission. The fraud was perpetrated against them, so it would be their decision. That was the law. That was how it worked. I called Sarah that evening. I asked her to come over. When she arrived, I walked her through the investigator's report. I showed her the timeline. I showed her the forged documents. I showed her where the money had gone. It took her about 20 minutes of reading before she started crying. But when she looked up at me, her face was clear. I asked her if she wanted to press charges. She said yes, immediately, without hesitation. Yes, she wanted to press charges. She wanted him prosecuted. She wanted this to stop. She was done protecting him. She was done explaining away his behavior. She wanted accountability. I called Jennifer next. Same conversation. Same result. She said yes. She wanted to press charges. She wanted this documented. She wanted him held responsible. Diana told me that if the girls hadn't been ready, she would have pressed charges herself. She said she'd have done it years ago if she'd known the full extent of what was happening. So I had their permission, I had their support, and I had the documentation. Everything I needed. Mum? The confrontation didn't happen at another family dinner. It happened at a police station with a detective present and a formal statement being taken. David was brought in for questioning on a Tuesday morning based on the fraud charges that Detective Morrison had initiated. He came into that interview room thinking he could charm his way out of it, the way he'd charmed his way through everything else. I know this because later, his public defender told me that David had been confident, had believed that once he explained the situation, they'd understand it was all a misunderstanding. He thought his charm would work. He thought his quick answers would work. He thought his ability to create doubt and reframe narratives would work. And then Detective Morrison laid out the evidence, the forged documents side by side with known samples of David's signature, the credit card applications with his name but Jennifer's signature, the unauthorized withdrawals from Sarah's accounts, the pattern of lies documented across communications, and David's face changed. For the first time, I wasn't there to witness it, but Morrison told me later that I watched the mask crack completely. He tried to explain. He tried to justify. He claimed Sarah had given him permission to access her accounts. He claimed the investments were legitimate opportunities that just hadn't panned out. He claimed Jennifer had agreed to co-sign the loan. But he hadn't been prepared for documentation. He hadn't been prepared for a forensic accountant who could trace every penny. He hadn't been prepared for the fact that eventually, truth and evidence are more powerful than charm and manipulation. The evidence was there. It was irrefutable. It was undeniable. Within 2 weeks, he was charged with 5 counts of fraud, 2 counts of forgery, 1 count of identity theft, and 1 count of financial abuse. The charges were serious, felony-level serious. The evidence was overwhelming. His public defender, a woman named Patricia Hayes, advised him that going to trial would be a mistake. The documentation was too solid. The forensic accounting was too thorough. The case against him was too strong. She advised him to take a plea deal, 18 months in prison, with an additional 8 years of probation. Restitution to my daughters totaling $315,000 to be paid out over 10 years from his prison wages and any future earnings. A restraining order keeping him away from Sarah and Jennifer for a period of 5 years after his release. He accepted the deal. He pleaded guilty. And that's when everything became real for Sarah and Jennifer in a way it hadn't been before. That's when they understood that the man they'd married, that the man they'd loved, that the man they'd trusted was actually a criminal. That's when Sarah filed for divorce. She did it immediately, not even waiting for him to be sentenced. Her lawyer was aggressive, petitioning the court for everything: the house, the cars, the savings, everything that could be traced back to community property. And the court agreed. With David's criminal charges on the record and his own admissions of guilt, the court was sympathetic to Sarah's petition. That's when Jennifer finally understood the full weight of what she'd almost signed up for. She told me later that if she'd co-signed that loan, if she'd put her name on that document, she would have been liable for the entire amount if it defaulted. She would have been tied to David's debt for years. The day he was sentenced, I sat in the courtroom with my daughters. Sarah on one side of me, Jennifer on the other, Diana right beside Sarah. The judge reviewed the charges, reviewed the evidence, read David's guilty pleas into the record. Then she handed down the sentence: 18 months in federal prison for fraud and forgery, another 6 months for identity theft and financial abuse, to be served concurrently. Restitution payments spanning the next 10 years. He'd have to repay every penny he'd stolen from my family. And when he got out, he'd have a felony conviction on his record. That conviction would follow him forever. It would show up on background checks. It would affect his employment prospects. It would impact his ability to rent an apartment or get a loan. It would affect every credit decision, every housing decision, every employment opportunity. He'd built his entire existence on being able to talk his way into places, to convince people he was legitimate and trustworthy and worthy of access and investment. And now that ability would be permanently compromised. Every lie he told in a job interview could be exposed with a simple background check. Every claim he made about his character would be undercut by that single document showing that he'd committed crimes. Walking out of the courtroom that day, I felt something release inside me that I didn't even know I'd been holding. It wasn't vengeance, it wasn't satisfaction exactly, though there was an element of satisfaction. It was justice. It was the understanding that the system, slow and methodical as it is, had functioned exactly as it was supposed to function. The guilty had been prosecuted. The victims had been protected. The evidence had spoken clearly and definitively. This is what I'd learned in my career in accounting. Truth leaves traces. Every fraudulent transaction is a record. Every lie leaves evidence. Every manipulation generates documentation. Bank statements don't lie. Credit card records don't lie. Forged signatures can be compared and analysed. All you have to do is look carefully enough, trace the money, follow the pattern, and the truth becomes impossible to deny. David Harmon had committed crimes, and now he was going to answer for them. Not through dramatic confrontation, not through public humiliation at a restaurant, but through the slow, methodical process of law enforcement and the justice system. After the sentencing, after David had been remanded into custody to begin serving his sentence, I went home. Diana was waiting. Sarah and Jennifer were there too. We stood in the kitchen for a long moment, none of us really knowing what to say. Then Sarah said something I'll never forget. She said, "Thank you for not letting this go. Thank you for actually doing something instead of just accepting it." Jennifer nodded, tears streaming down her face. I told them that I'd made a decision that night at the restaurant. I'd decided that no matter what it took, no matter how long it took, I wasn't going to let this man extract any more value from our family. I wasn't going to let him rewrite the story of who we were or what we deserved. I wasn't going to let him define me by his cruelty or undermine my daughters with his predatory behaviour, and I'd meant that. Every step I'd taken after that moment, hiring the investigator, consulting the lawyer, gathering documentation, bringing the evidence to the police, every step had been about protecting my family and ensuring that David understood that his actions had consequences. Real consequences, legal consequences, consequences that would follow him for the rest of his life. The thing about financial predators is that they rely on silence. They rely on shame. They rely on the victim being too embarrassed to report what's happening, too afraid to rock the boat, too willing to accept the narrative that they are the problem. But once you break that silence, once you decide that you're not going to accept the shame that belongs to him, once you start talking about what actually happened and gathering evidence and involving the authorities, everything changes. The power dynamic flips. The predator becomes the accused, the victim becomes the witness, and truth becomes your weapon. That's something David didn't understand when he was charming his way through family dinners and restaurants. He didn't understand that I'd spent a career following the money, understanding financial systems, recognizing patterns. He thought I was just an old man who could be undermined and isolated. He didn't understand that I was someone who would actually do something about it. I think about that night at the restaurant sometimes. I think about that moment when the bill was placed in front of me, when David smiled that smile, when he delivered that message about who belonged at the table and who didn't. And I think about how wrong his calculation was. He'd thought I was someone he could break. He'd thought I was someone whose worth was determined by his approval or disapproval. He'd thought I was weak because I was older. He'd thought I was outdated, irrelevant, someone whose concerns could be dismissed as paranoia or overprotectiveness or inability to let go. But strength isn't about physical power. It isn't about backing down in the face of intimidation. It's about knowing when to fight, and how to fight in a way that actually matters. It's about using your experience and knowledge and resources to protect people you love. It's about understanding systems, following evidence, and refusing to accept a narrative written by someone else. It's about writing your own ending. Sarah and Jennifer are rebuilding their lives now. They're both in therapy, processing the betrayal and the manipulation. They're learning to trust their instincts again, learning that when something feels wrong, there's usually a concrete reason it feels wrong. They're learning not to second-guess themselves when someone in a position of trust is behaving suspiciously. Diana and I are closer than we've ever been. We talk more openly about our concerns, about red flags, about the difference between supporting family members and enabling their harmful behaviour. We've learned the hard way that love isn't about accepting whatever someone does. Sometimes love is about saying no. Sometimes love is about drawing boundaries, and I'm using my experience in accounting, my knowledge of financial manipulation and fraud, to help others now. I've started working with a non-profit that helps victims of financial abuse. I teach seminars on how to protect yourself, how to recognize the signs of financial predation, how to document and report fraud. I do it because I know how easy it is to be manipulated if you don't understand the mechanics of what's happening. And I do it because I know how powerful it is to have someone in your corner who believes you, who takes you seriously, who actually does something about the problem instead of just offering sympathy and advice to move on. David's sentence will be completed in another year and some months. When he gets out, he'll have a felony record, a debt to repay to my daughters spanning a decade, and a life that will be infinitely harder than it was before. But that's not what matters to me anymore. What matters is that my family is safe. What matters is that Sarah and Jennifer understand their own worth and aren't vulnerable to the same kind of manipulation anymore. What matters is that we've all learned that speaking up, that fighting back, that not accepting humiliation or abuse actually works. It takes time. It takes evidence. It takes cooperation with the legal system. But it works. That night at the restaurant, I thought the bill was the worst part. But it wasn't. The worst part would have been accepting it, normalizing it, letting him continue his predation uninterrupted. That's what would have been truly costly. That's what would have destroyed everything. Instead, I pushed the bill back across the table. I stood up. I walked out with my family, and I never stopped fighting from that moment on. And that decision, that moment when I decided I wasn't going to be a victim anymore, that I wasn't going to accept his version of who I was and what I deserved, that's what actually changed everything.